She spent her last dollar on a birthday steak for herself, then gave it away to 3 massive silver wolves in a rain-soaked alley. What she didn't know, their father, the Lycan King, was watching from the shadows, and he'd already decided she belonged to him. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick comment below and let me know what draws you to Shifter Romance. Your engagement really helps support this channel. The Brass and Time Bistro wasn't the kind of place Nora Belwin could afford to eat at, she just worked there. Tucked between a high-rise bank and an artisan cocktail bar, the upscale restaurant sat on a corner where the city's elite came to be seen, where valets rushed through rain to protect designer umbrellas, and where a single cut of Wagyu cost more than Nora's weekly grocery budget. Its Edison bulbs glowed warm behind floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light onto wet cobblestones that reflected the blur of tail lights and storefront neon. But for Nora, tonight, it was supposed to be everything. She sat alone at the kitchen's prep station during her break, a single white plate before her. At 25, she'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of double shifts, the sizzle of pans on open flame, the sharp bark of Chef Laurent's orders, the clatter of dishes being rushed to tables where she'd never be invited to sit. Business had been brutal for months now. The new exec chef had brought in his own people, pushing out the old guard one by one. Nora had survived longer than most, but she felt the walls closing in. Tonight was her birthday, and she'd done something reckless, used her employee discount to buy herself a 4-ounce Wagyu ribeye, perfectly marbled, the kind of cut that made her hands tremble when she seared it. She was about to take the first bite when she saw them. Through the rain-streaked service door window, barely visible in the alley behind the restaurant, 3 pairs of eyes glowed amber in the darkness. Massive shapes, too large to be dogs, huddled against the brick wall where steam vents offered the only warmth. Their silver-gray fur was matted and soaked, and even from inside, Nora could see them shivering. She blinked, and when she looked again, there was something else, a 4th figure standing deeper in the alley, barely visible through the downpour. A tall, pale silhouette with long silver-white hair, watching, not the animals, watching her. Trick of the rain, she told herself, but her heart had already started hammering. The sound of a slamming pan startled her. Greg, the night manager, appeared in the doorway, his expression twisted with his usual contempt for the staff he considered beneath him. "Belwin, what the hell are you doing? Your break's over. And is that—" His eyes locked onto her plate. "Is that the missing Wagyu from tonight's inventory?" Nora's stomach dropped, but she didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her plate, pushed past Greg's sputtering protests, and walked straight out into the rain. The alley was darker than it had looked from inside, the kind of darkness that pressed against your skin. The rain was cold, turning her chef's whites translucent within seconds, but Nora barely noticed. The 3 wolves, because that's what they were, she could see now. Far too large and far too intelligent to be stray dogs had moved closer. They stood in a semicircle, heads lowered, eyes fixed on the plate in her hands. This close, she could see the way their ribs showed through their fur, the way their massive paws trembled against the wet concrete. "Hey," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's okay. I know what it's like to be hungry." She knelt in a puddle, ruining her work pants, and set the plate down between them. The steak steamed in the cold air, perfectly cooked medium rare, the smell of butter and rosemary rising even through the rain. The wolves didn't move. They watched her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. "Go on," she said softly. "Happy birthday to me, right?" She tried to smile, but her throat was too tight. "Someone should enjoy it." The largest wolf, silver fur tipped with black, eyes like molten gold, stepped forward first. It sniffed the meat once, then looked directly at her, and Nora would swear for the rest of her life that it nodded. Then all three of them lunged forward, not in aggression, but in desperate hunger. They devoured the steak in seconds, then licked the plate clean, their massive tongues scraping porcelain. Nora laughed, the sound brittle and broken, and reached out to touch the nearest wolf. Its fur was coarse and wet under her fingers, but warm, alive. Belwyn. She jerked her head up. Greg stood in the service door, backlit by the kitchen's fluorescent glare, his phone already in his hand. You're done. Theft of inventory. Abandoning your station, pack your knives. You're fired. The wolves growled, a sound so deep it vibrated through the ground. And in the window behind, Greg barely visible in the reflection, but unmistakable now, stood the man from the alley, pale, silver-haired, watching her with eyes that glowed the exact same amber as the wolves at her feet. He smiled, and Nora's world tilted. She hadn't fed strays. She'd fed something ancient, something powerful, something that had been testing her. And now, she realized as the man's reflection stepped forward through the rain without making a sound, she belonged to him. The fluorescent lights of the kitchen felt obscene after the darkness of the alley. Nora stood dripping on the rubber floor mats, her chef's whites clinging to her skin, while Greg's voice rattled off violations she'd supposedly committed. Theft, insubordination, contamination of workspace. The words blurred together, meaningless noise compared to the memory of those amber eyes watching her through the rain. Are you even listening to me? Greg's face had gone red, a vein throbbing at his temple. He was shorter than Nora by 3 inches, something that clearly bothered him based on how often he stood too close, trying to loom. I said you're done. Security's already been called to escort you out. Nora looked past him to where Chef Laurent stood by the pass, arms crossed, saying nothing. She'd worked under Laurent for 3 years, had learned to break down a chicken in under 2 minutes because he demanded it, had burned her forearms on oven racks rushing to meet his impossible standards. Now he wouldn't even meet her eyes. The Wagyu was purchased with my employee discount, Nora said, her voice flat. I have the receipt in my locker. Which you abandoned your station to consume during service hours, Greg shot back, and then contaminated by bringing it into an unsecured area. Do you have any idea what the health department would— It's my birthday. The words came out smaller than she intended. I don't care if it's Christmas. Greg pulled a manila envelope from under his arm, the kind that always meant bad news. Your final check, minus the cost of the inventory you wasted feeding strays in the alley like some kind of Disney princess. He shoved it against her chest. Clean out your locker. You have 10 minutes. The kitchen had gone quiet. 20 pairs of eyes watched from behind prep stations and ranges, some sympathetic, most just relieved it wasn't them. Nora took the envelope with numb fingers and turned toward the locker room. And Belwyn? Greg's voice followed her. Good luck finding another kitchen job in this city. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why you were terminated. Her hands shook as she spun the combination lock. Inside the narrow metal locker was everything she owned that mattered: her knife roll, a spare pair of non-slip clogs, and a photo of her mother she kept tucked in the door. The woman in the picture smiled out at her. Forever 32. Forever telling Nora that kindness was the only currency that counted. Look where that got you, Nora thought bitterly, pulling the photo free. Look where it got me. She wrapped her knives carefully, each one a small fortune she'd saved for over years. Her 8-inch chef's knife, perfectly balanced. Her boning knife with the rosewood handle. Her paring knife that fit her grip like it had been made for her. They were the only things she'd never pawned, never sold, even when the rent was late. The rain had intensified by the time she pushed through the employee exit into the alley. It came down in sheets now, turning the world into a watercolor blur. The wolves were gone, but their presence lingered. She could smell wet fur and something else, something wild and electric that made the hair on her neck stand up. Nora pulled her knife roll close to her chest and started walking. She had $43 in her bank account, 2 weeks until her rent was due, and nowhere to go except a studio apartment that barely qualified as shelter. The city stretched out before her, cold and indifferent, its lights reflecting off puddles that swallowed her feet with each step. She didn't see the black car until it pulled alongside her, moving so quietly she only noticed when its window rolled down. A man sat in the driver's seat, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses despite the night and rain. "Nora Belwyn," he said. It wasn't a question. "Get in. Someone wants to speak with you about a job." Every instinct screamed at her to run. But Nora looked down at her soaked clothes, at her knife roll growing heavier with each step, at the rain that showed no signs of stopping. She opened the door and climbed inside. The interior of the car smelled like leather and something else, something sharp and metallic that Nora couldn't identify. The seats were heated, a luxury so foreign after the cold rain that she almost flinched. The driver didn't look at her as she settled in, just raised the window and pulled back into traffic with the smooth precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Where are we going?" Nora asked, clutching her knife roll against her chest like a shield. Up close, she could see the driver better: square jaw, military haircut, a scar that ran from his left ear down into his collar. His hands on the wheel were scarred, too, knuckles that had been broken and healed wrong. "Somewhere dry," he said. His voice had a rough quality, like gravel scraping metal. "Boss wants to meet you. Make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" Nora's survival instincts finally kicked in, adrenaline cutting through her exhaustion. "And how do you know my name? Have you been following me?" "You fed his sons?" The driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror for the first time, and Nora's breath caught. They were pale gray, almost colorless, and they reflected the streetlights like an animal's. That makes you someone worth following. His sons. The wolves. Nora's mind raced, trying to process what that meant. What kind of man had children who were? "I don't understand," she said, but her voice came out as a whisper. "You will." The driver, Nate, he'd said his name was Nate, when he'd first spoken, took a turn that led away from the familiar grid of downtown, heading toward the hills where the city gave way to old-growth forest. "The position is live-in, private estate. You'd be responsible for meal preparation and general care for 3 minors, ages 7 to 10. Salary is $15,000 a month, plus room and board." Nora choked. 15. That's not real. That's plus hazard pay. Nate continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Given the nature of the household, the boys can be difficult. Previous staff have found them challenging to manage." "How challenging?" Nora asked, though she was starting to suspect she knew the answer. Last nanny lasted 4 days. One before that made it almost 2 weeks. But she made the mistake of trying to lock them in their rooms during a full moon. Nate's expression didn't change, but something cold slithered down Nora's spine. Boss had to pay a significant settlement to keep her quiet. The car climbed higher, the city lights falling away behind them. Trees pressed close to the narrow road, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the sky. Nora caught glimpses of high walls through the rain, wrought iron topped with decorative spikes that looked more functional than aesthetic. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then I'll drive you back to your apartment." Nate's tone suggested he already knew she wouldn't refuse. "But you should know the boys have been asking about you. They don't usually take to strangers. The one who fed them, they said. The one who smelled like rosemary and kindness. They want you to stay." "Rosemary." from the butter she'd used on the steak. Nora's throat tightened. The car slowed as massive gates appeared through the rain. Black iron twisted into shapes that might have been wolves or might have been something worse. They opened silently, responding to some signal Nora didn't see, and the car rolled through onto a gravel drive lined with ancient oaks. Blackwood Estate revealed itself gradually through the downpour. It wasn't a house, it was a mansion, all stone and sharp angles, with towers that disappeared into the low clouds and windows that glowed with amber light. Gothic and imposing, it looked like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built on it. "Last chance," Nate said as he pulled up to the entrance, where a covered portico offered shelter from the rain. "You walk in there. You're making a choice. This world doesn't let people go easy." Nora looked at her reflection in the car window, soaked, exhausted, holding everything she owned in a canvas knife roll. She thought about her empty apartment, her negative bank balance, the way Greg's sneer had felt like a brand. She thought about 3 pairs of amber eyes in the rain, watching her with something that might have been hope. "I'm already in," she said, and opened the door. The rain had stopped, she realized as she stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and something else, that same electric wildness from the alley. The front doors opened before she reached them, revealing a tall figure backlit by firelight. "Miss Belwyn," said a voice that resonated in her chest like a physical touch. "Welcome to Blackwood. We've been waiting for you." The man in the doorway wasn't what Nora expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd been expecting. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with silver-white hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that caught the firelight with an amber gleam. His face was sharp and elegant, almost too perfect, like something carved from pale marble. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with scars that looked like claw marks. "I'm Dominic Crow," he said, and the way he said his own name made it sound like a claim of ownership over everything in sight, including her. "Please, come in. You're shivering." Nora hadn't realized she was. She followed him through an entrance hall that belonged in a museum, all dark wood paneling and oil paintings of stern-faced men with the same amber eyes. A fire roared in a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, but the warmth didn't quite reach the shadowed corners where the ceiling disappeared into darkness. "The boys are upstairs," Dominic said, leading her toward a curved staircase. "They've been agitated since the alley. They refuse to eat, won't sleep, keep asking when you're coming. I've never seen them react to anyone this way." "What are they?" Nora asked, then immediately regretted it. But Dominic just smiled, and there was something predatory in it that made her acutely aware of how alone she was. "They're children," he said. "Wild, stubborn, occasionally violent children, who happen to be the heirs to something older than this city. But right now, they're just hungry boys who need someone who understands them." He stopped at a heavy wooden door, marked with scratches that looked disturbingly like they'd been made from the inside. "Fair warning they bite." He opened the door, and chaos erupted. 3 small bodies launched themselves at Nora with inhuman speed. She barely had time to drop her knife roll before they collided with her, their hands grabbing at her clothes, her arms, her hair. They were boys, she could see that now 7, maybe 8 years old, with silver blonde hair and eyes that glowed amber in the dim light. They wore torn clothes that looked expensive once, and their feet were bare and dirty. "You came!" the smallest one shouted, his voice high and fierce. "Father said you would, but Ash said you'd run away and never come back, and—" "She smells like the alley," the middle one interrupted, pressing his face against Nora's shoulder and inhaling deeply. "Like rain and meat, and—" The third, the largest with silver black-tipped hair, stood back slightly. studying her with unnerving intensity. "You gave us your food," he said quietly. "Your birthday food. Why?" Nora's heart hammered, but she forced herself to kneel down to their level, meeting their eyes one by one. This close, she could see the way their pupils contracted like a wolf's, the slight point to their canines, the inhuman grace in how they moved. "Because you were hungry," she said simply. "And nobody should be hungry on someone's birthday. Not even—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Not even 3 princes hiding in an alley?" The boys went very still. Behind her, she heard Dominic make a sound that might have been surprise. "We're not hiding," the largest boy said, but his voice had lost its edge. "We were hunting." "In an alley behind a restaurant?" Nora raised an eyebrow. "That's not hunting. That's scavenging. There's a difference." The middle boy, the one who'd smelled her, giggled, a startlingly normal sound. "She's funny. Can we keep her, Father?" "That depends on whether she can feed you," Dominic said from the doorway. His voice carried an undercurrent of challenge. "They haven't eaten in 3 days. Won't touch anything the kitchen prepares. Perhaps you'll have better luck." Nora stood slowly, the boys tracking her movement with predatory focus. "Show me the kitchen," she said, "and tell me what you have for protein. High quality, preferably. They need fat content, not lean cuts." "How did you—" "They're not human," Nora said bluntly, surprising herself with her own directness. "Human children would eat anything after 3 days. These 3 are waiting for something specific." She looked down at the boys, who watched her with something like hope dawning in their amber eyes. "They're waiting for someone who understands what they actually need." 20 minutes later, Nora stood at a commercial range that would have made Chef Laurent weep with envy, searing 3 thick ribeyes in a cast-iron skillet with butter, rosemary, and coarse salt. The same meal from the alley, elevated. The kitchen smelled like heaven, and behind her, she could hear the boys' breathing quicken, could hear the soft whimpers they couldn't quite suppress. When she plated the meat rare, almost raw in the center, the way the wolves had preferred it, the boys descended on it like starving animals. They ate with their hands, tearing into the beef with teeth that were sharper than they should be, making sounds of pleasure that were distinctly inhuman. Dominic watched from the kitchen entrance, his expression unreadable. "You're not afraid of them," he said. Nora met his eyes. "Should I be?" "Most people are." He moved closer, and the air seemed to thicken around him. "Most people see monsters." "I see children," Nora said, watching the smallest boy lick his fingers clean. "Hungry children who needed someone to feed them properly. That's all." Something flickered across Dominic's face. Surprise? Or maybe satisfaction. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "you're exactly what this family needs." Nora's room was in the east wing, up 3 flights of stairs and down a corridor lined with portraits of silver-haired men and women whose eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The room itself was larger than her entire apartment had been, with a 4-poster bed, a fireplace that had already been lit, and windows that overlooked the forest stretching endlessly into darkness. She'd just finished unpacking her meager belongings, her knives laid carefully on the dresser, her mother's photo propped against the lamp when she heard footsteps in the hall. Not the quick patter of the boys, but something heavier, deliberate. She opened the door to find Dominic standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight's reach, and the air between them felt suddenly charged, like the moment before lightning struck. "The boys are asleep," he said. His voice was quieter now, almost intimate in the silence of the late hour. "First time in days. Whatever you did, it worked." "I fed them," Nora said, though her pulse quickened at the way he was looking at her. "That's what you hired me for." "I hired you because my sons chose you in an alley." Dominic stepped closer, into the light. and Nora could see the way the shadows seemed to cling to him, reluctant to let go. They've never done that before, never trusted a human on instinct alone. I needed to understand why. And do you? Nora asked, fighting the urge to step back. There was something overwhelming about his presence, something that made her feel like prey being circled by something much larger and infinitely more dangerous. Not yet. His eyes caught the firelight, reflecting it back like mirrors. But I'm beginning to. You don't see them as cursed. You see them as children who happen to be other. Aren't they? Nora's voice came out steadier than she felt. Children first, whatever else second? Dominic's expression shifted into something that might have been pain. Most of the world would disagree with you. Most would say they're monsters wearing the faces of children, that they should be locked away or destroyed before they can. He stopped himself, jaw tightening. There are people who would kill them just for existing. The raw edge in his voice made Nora's chest ache. She thought of the boys' fierce joy when they'd recognized her, the way they'd eaten like they were starving not just for food but for acceptance. Then those people are idiots, she said bluntly. Your sons are extraordinary. Dangerous, maybe, but so is fire. You don't destroy it, you learn to work with it. Something flickered in Dominic's eyes, hot and intense. He moved closer, near enough now that Nora could smell him pine and smoke and something wild that made her hindbrain scream warnings she didn't want to hear. The air between them seemed to thrum with a frequency she could feel in her bones. There are rules here, he said, his voice dropping to something that was almost a growl. Rules that will keep you safe. The most important one is this. Never enter the North Wing during a full moon. Not for any reason. Not if you hear screaming, not if you hear the boys calling for you, not if you hear me begging you to run. His hand came up, fingers ghosting along her jaw without quite touching. Do you understand? Nora's breath caught. This close, she could see the inhuman quality of his eyes, the way his pupils contracted and dilated independent of the light. What happens in the North Wing? Nothing you want to witness. His fingers finally made contact, cool against her flushed skin. We're not like the children, Nora. We don't have their control. On the full moon, we're exactly what the stories say we are, monsters. Beautiful, terrible, and utterly without mercy. The way he said her name made something low in her stomach coil tight. And the rest of the month? The rest of the month, we're almost human. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Nora couldn't tell if she was shaking from fear or something far more dangerous. Almost. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Why warn me if you're so sure I'll stay away? Dominic leaned in, his lips nearly brushing her ear. Because you're the kind of person who feeds strays in the rain, the kind who sees monsters and calls them children, the kind who might be stupid enough to try to save us. His breath was warm against her skin, and I need you to understand on the full moon, there is no saving us. There's only surviving until dawn. He pulled back abruptly, the sudden distance between them like a physical shock. The next full moon is in 12 days, he said, his voice returning to something more controlled. I'll have Nate ensure you're secured in the South Wing that night. Until then, the boys will need breakfast at 7. They prefer their eggs scrambled with cream and their bacon crisp but not burnt. He turned to leave, and Nora found her voice. Dominic! He stopped but didn't turn around. Thank you, she said, for the warning. Don't thank me yet. His silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the hall's amber light. You haven't seen what we become. When you do, you might wish you'd stayed in that alley and let us starve. Then he was gone, and Nora was left alone with the fire's crackle and the memory of his touch still burning on her skin. Nora woke to the sound of snarling. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in the alley, rain-soaked and kneeling before three massive wolves. But then the silk sheets registered and she remembered where she was. The snarling was coming from somewhere below her window, guttural and vicious, followed by a man's sharp laugh. She dressed quickly in the clothes that had been left for her dark jeans and a soft sweater that probably cost more than her entire previous wardrobe, and followed the sound down to the estate's rear courtyard. Morning mist clung to the ground, turning the manicured lawn into something ethereal and strange. The boys were there, crouched low in fighting stances that looked far too practiced for children their age, facing off against a man Nora hadn't seen before. He was massive, easily as tall as Dominic, but broader, with the build of someone who'd spent years breaking things with his bare hands. His hair was dark red, almost rust-colored, and pulled back in a knot. When he turned at the sound of her approach, his eyes were a cold green that assessed her with open contempt. "So you're the new pet," he said, his voice carrying that same growl she'd heard from Dominic but without any of the control. "The human who thinks she can handle the princes. How long do you think you'll last? A week? 3 days?" "Kurt." Nate appeared from the shadows near the house, his expression harder than Nora had seen it. "Boss said she's off limits." "Boss says a lot of things." Kurt moved toward Nora with a swagger that made her skin crawl. "But he's not here right now, is he? Business in the city. Which means I'm in charge of estate security, and I don't like unknowns wandering around making the airs go soft." The boys had gone rigid, their eyes fixed on Kurt with an intensity that made the hair on Nora's neck stand up. The smallest one she'd learned, his name was Kai, had started to tremble, his hands curling into claws at his sides. "I'm not making anyone soft," Nora said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I'm feeding them. That's my job." "Your job?" Kurt laughed, the sound ugly. "Your job is to be another human who gets broken when reality hits. You think you're special because you gave them some meat in an alley? You think that makes you pack?" He was close now, close enough that she could smell the aggression rolling off him like heat. "You're prey, little human. You'll always be prey. And the moment they get hungry enough, they'll remember what you really are." His hand shot out, faster than Nora could track, fingers closing around her wrist hard enough to bruise. "Let me show you what you're dealing with," he said, and his grip tightened until she felt bones grind together. The pain was sharp and immediate, but what happened next was faster. The boys exploded into motion, launching themselves at Kurt with synchronized precision that spoke of pack tactics bred into their bones. Their eyes had gone completely amber, glowing in the morning mist, and the sounds coming from their throats weren't remotely human. "Touch her again," the eldest boy, Ash, snarled, his voice distorted and deeper than it should be. "And we'll rip your throat out." Kurt released Nora's wrist, but he was grinning now, something savage and satisfied in his expression. "There it is," he said. "That's what you're protecting, human. That's what they really are under all your pretty cooking and maternal nonsense. Killers. Just like their father, just like all of us." Blood trickled from Nora's wrist where his nails, no claws, had broken the skin. The boy's nostrils flared at the scent, their pupils contracting to vertical slits. She could see them fighting something, their small bodies shaking with the effort of control. They looked exactly like they had in the alley, predatory, dangerous, barely contained. "Back to the house," Nora said quietly, addressing the boys. "Now—" "But he hurt you," Kai whimpered, still staring at her bleeding wrist. "He made you bleed. We should—" "You should listen to me," Nora said, forcing steel into her voice despite the way her wrist throbbed. "Inside, kitchen. I'll make you breakfast, and we can talk about what just happened." Ash looked like he wanted to argue. His amber eyes still locked on Kurt with murderous intent, but something in Nora's tone made him hesitate. Slowly, with clear reluctance, the three boys began backing toward the house, never taking their eyes off the guard who'd threatened their nanny. "Smart woman," Kurt called after them, "teaching them to run from a real fight." Nora turned on him, and something in her expression made his smile falter. "They're children," she said, her voice low and dangerous in a way she didn't know she possessed. "Not soldiers. Not weapons. Children. And if you ever touch me again, if you ever threaten them again, I will make sure Dominic knows exactly how you treat his sons when he's not watching." She walked back to the house with her head high, blood dripping from her wrist onto the perfect grass, and pretended she couldn't feel Kurt's eyes burning into her back. Behind her, she heard Nate speak, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You just made a very stupid mistake," Nate said. "The boss doesn't like people who damage his things, and I think he's decided that one's his." Inside, the boys waited for her in the kitchen, their eyes still glowing amber, still trembling with barely suppressed violence. But when Nora knelt down and opened her arms, they crashed into her, holding on like she was the only solid thing in their world, and she realized with crystal clarity that Kurt had been right about one thing. She was prey in a house full of predators. But somehow, impossibly, she was also theirs. The boys refused to let Nora tend to her wrist alone. They sat in a semicircle on the kitchen floor while she ran cold water over the cuts, their eyes tracking every drop of blood that swirled down the drain with an intensity that should have frightened her. Should have, but didn't. She understood now what she was seeing, the same hunger that had drawn them to the alley, the same desperate need that made them tremble when she cooked. "Does it hurt?" Kai asked, his voice small and guilty. "We should have been faster. Should have stopped him before." "You were plenty fast," Nora said, drying her wrist and wrapping it with gauze from the extensive first aid kit she'd found in the pantry. "Someone in this house clearly understood that injuries were inevitable, and you protected me. That's what matters." "We wanted to kill him," Ash said flatly. The eldest boy sat with his back against the counter, arms wrapped around his knees, still radiating barely contained violence. "We wanted to tear his throat out and watch him bleed. That's what we're supposed to do when someone threatens Pack." Pack. The word hung in the air between them, significant in ways Nora was only beginning to understand. "But you didn't," she said, crouching down to meet his eyes. "You controlled it. You listened to me when I told you to come inside. That takes more strength than killing, Ash. That's real power." He looked away, jaw tight. "Father says control is what separates us from animals, but sometimes I think he's wrong. Sometimes I think the animal part is the honest part, and everything else is just pretending." Before Nora could respond, her stomach growled loudly, breaking the tension. The boys' heads snapped toward her in unison, and she laughed despite herself. "Right. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Let me make us all breakfast and we can—" "You need meat," the middle boy Cole interrupted. "Not bread or eggs or the sweet things humans like. Real meat. Protein. Fat." He was staring at her wrapped wrist again, and Nora suddenly understood the strange intensity in his gaze. "You're healing wrong, because you don't eat right. You smell like you're fading." "Fading?" Nora touched her wrist instinctively. "Weak," Ash clarified. "Humans always smell weak to us, but you're worse since you came here. You're burning energy you don't have, taking care of us when you should be taking care of yourself." His amber eyes met hers, ancient and knowing, despite his young face. "It's what you did in the alley, too. Gave us your food when you needed it more." The observation was so accurate it made her chest tight. Nora thought about her empty apartment, The meals she'd skip to save money, the way she'd always put everyone else first, until there was nothing left for herself. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Kindness is the only currency that counts. But kindness, she was learning, could hollow you out if you weren't careful. Okay, she said quietly. Then teach me. What should I be eating? What do you need that I'm not giving you? The boys exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Kai stood and walked to the massive refrigerator, pulling it open to reveal shelves stocked with cuts of meat that would make any butcher weep, whole tenderloins, racks of lamb, thick ribeyes marbled with fat. But the boys ignored all of it, going instead to a locked drawer at the bottom. Father keeps the real food here, Kai said, pulling a key from around his neck. Inside the drawer were packages wrapped in brown paper, unlabeled, the meat inside so dark it was nearly purple. This is what we need, what our bodies understand. But nobody wants to give it to us because it's too expensive, too rare, too raw, Cole finished. They want us to eat it cooked, civilized, human. But we can't. Our bodies reject it. We need it like this, fresh and bloody and real. Nora unwrapped one of the packages, and the smell hit her immediately iron and salt, and something primal that made her mouth water despite never having liked rare meat before. She thought about the alley, about how the boys had devoured the Wagyu like they were starving, about the way Dominic had watched from the window with those same amber eyes. The man from the window, the pale figure who'd stood in the rain while she fed his sons. She'd thought he was a stranger, a passerby, but she understood now. He'd been there deliberately, watching, testing, waiting to see what she would do. And when she'd given away her birthday meal without hesitation, he'd made a decision. Your father, she said slowly, pieces clicking into place. He was there that night, in the alley. Before you came to the bistro looking for me, he was already watching, already deciding. Ash nodded. He smelled you first, caught your scent 3 blocks away and followed it. He was going to pass by, but then he saw you through the window, alone on your birthday, about to eat something that cost you more than you could afford. He sent us to test you, to see if you'd share or if you'd be like all the others who see monsters and run. And when you gave us everything, Cole added softly, when you knelt in the rain and let us eat from your hands like we were worth feeding, Father knew. He said you were the one who could see what we are and not be afraid. Nora's hands trembled as she held the raw meat, understanding flooding through her. The job offer that came too fast. The salary that was absurd. The way Dominic looked at her like she was something precious and dangerous and already his. None of it had been chance. He chose me, she whispered. Before I ever walked through those gates, the moment I fed you in the alley, he'd already decided I belonged here. Not just here, Ash said, his young face serious beyond his years. To him, Father doesn't just hire people, Miss Nora. He claims them. And I think he claimed you the second you proved you'd bleed yourself dry to feed his sons. The attack came 3 nights later, when the moon was just past half and Dominic was in the city dealing with what he'd called pack politics. Nora had just finished preparing dinner venison, rare and bloody the way the boys needed it when she heard glass shatter in the east wing. Not the delicate tinkle of an accident, but the explosive crash of something massive going through a window. The boys' heads snapped up in unison, their eyes flooding amber. Iron Claw, Ash hissed, already moving toward the kitchen door. They've breached the perimeter. Nora's mind raced. She'd heard the name whispered by the staff in tones of fear and hatred, the rival pack that wanted Dominic's territory, that saw his half-human sons as abominations weakening the bloodline. Nate had mentioned them once, saying they'd been probing the estate's defenses for months, waiting for an opening. "Pantry," Nora said, her voice cutting through the boys' growls. "Now, all three of you." "We should fight," Cole protested, but his voice shook. He was 7 years old, pretending to be brave while his hands trembled. "We're princes. We should defend our territory." "You're children," Nora said, already herding them backward. The sounds of fighting were getting closer, snarls, crashes, Nate's voice shouting orders. "And your father would never forgive me if I let you die trying to be heroes before you're ready. Pantry. Hide behind the flour sacks. Don't come out until I say so, no matter what you hear." Ash grabbed her wrist, his grip desperate. "They'll kill you. You're human. You can't—" "I'm your nanny," Nora said, forcing herself to sound calmer than she felt. "Which means keeping you alive is literally my only job. Now hide. That's an order." The boys disappeared into the walk-in pantry just as the kitchen door exploded inward. The creature that came through barely looked human anymore. It was massive. Caught mid-transformation, its face elongated into something between man and wolf, its body covered in rust-colored fur. Claws scraped against the tile floor as it rose to its full height, easily 7 feet, and fixed its yellow eyes on Nora with predatory focus. "Human!" it growled, its voice distorted and wet. "Where are the whelps? Where are Crow's mongrel sons?" Nora's hand closed around the handle of her cast-iron skillet, 12 inches, 5 pounds of seasoned steel that she'd used to sear the venison. It was still hot from the stove, and she lifted it like a weapon, her body positioning itself between the intruder and the pantry door. "Not here," she lied. "Dominic took them to the city. It's just me and the kitchen staff." The creature laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Liar! I can smell them." Smell their fear, their anger, their pathetic human blood diluting the pure strain. It took a step closer, and Nora could smell the rot on its breath, see the madness in its eyes. "Step aside, meat. This doesn't concern you." "Everything concerning those boys concerns me," Nora said, and swung the skillet with every ounce of strength she possessed. The pan connected with the creature's jaw in a spray of spit and blood. It wasn't enough to kill, she'd known it wouldn't be, but the surprise and pain made it stagger, giving her precious seconds. She swung again, aiming for the temple this time, the cast iron singing through the air like a weapon forged for exactly this purpose. "You dare!" the creature snarled. But Nora was already moving, muscle memory from years of working in cramped kitchens guiding her around its clumsy swipe. She grabbed the pot of boiling stock from the stove with her free hand and threw it, scalding liquid hitting the creature's face and chest. Its howl of pain was deeply satisfying. "I'm a sous chef," Nora said, circling to keep herself between the monster and the pantry. Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own voice. "You think I don't know how to work with sharp objects and high heat? You think I haven't burned myself and kept working? You're in my kitchen now, you bastard. And nobody threatens my boys in my kitchen." The creature lunged, faster than something that size should move. Claws raked across Nora's shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin, but she twisted and brought the skillet down on its extended wrist, with a crack that might have been bone-breaking. It roared, and she could see more movement in the doorway behind it, more wolves, more enemies pouring into her sanctuary. She was going to die. The thought came crystal clear and strangely calm. She was human, armed with nothing but cookware, facing creatures that could tear her apart without effort. But she'd bought the boys time. That had to count for something. "Nora! Down!" She dropped without thinking, trained by years of responding to shouted orders in chaotic kitchens. Something massive sailed over her head, a blur of silver-white fur and lethal grace, and the creature in front of her was suddenly gone, torn away by something even bigger and infinitely more terrifying. Dominic stood in her kitchen, but not as a man. He was enormous, easily 9 feet of muscle and fury, his wolf form caught between beast and nightmare, silver fur matted with blood that wasn't his. His amber eyes found hers for one impossible second, and there was nothing human in them, only rage and possession, and a promise of violence that made her earlier attackers look tame. "Mine," he snarled, the word barely recognizable through his transformed jaws, and then he was among them, ripping and tearing with the efficiency of something ancient and absolutely without mercy. Nora stayed down, clutching her skillet like a talisman, and watched the Lycan King defend what he'd claimed. The violence lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes of snarls and screaming, of bodies hitting walls hard enough to crack stone, of blood spraying across her carefully organized kitchen in patterns that would haunt her dreams. Dominic moved through the intruders like a force of nature, all silver fury and calculated brutality. This wasn't the controlled man who'd warned her about the full moon. This was the monster he'd promised he could become. Beautiful and terrible and absolutely merciless. When the last Ironclaw wolf stopped twitching, Dominic stood in the center of the carnage, his massive chest heaving, blood dripping from claws that were longer than Nora's fingers. Slowly, with visible effort, he began to shift back. The transformation was grotesque and fascinating, bones cracking and reforming, fur receding into pale skin, the wolf folding back into the shape of a man. Within seconds, Dominic stood human again, naked and covered in gore, his amber eyes still wild with rage and adrenaline. "The boys," he said, his voice rough and strained. "Where?" "Pantry," Nora managed, still on the floor, her shoulders screaming where the claws had torn through. "They're safe. I hid them before." The pantry door exploded open, and 3 small bodies launched themselves not at their father, but at Nora, crashing into her with enough force to knock her flat. Their hands were everywhere, checking her wounds, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus of, "Are you okay? And you're bleeding, and we should have helped, and we're sorry, we're sorry, we're sorry." "I told you to stay hidden," Nora said, but her voice broke on the words. The adrenaline was draining now, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and pain that made her vision blur. "You were hurt," Kai sobbed against her chest, his small body shaking. "We heard you scream and we wanted to come out, but Ash said we had to trust you and—" "You did perfect," Nora whispered, pulling them closer despite the agony in her shoulder. "You stayed safe. That's all that matters." "All that matters?" Dominic's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He was moving toward them now, still naked and bloody, and the fury in his eyes made Nora's breath catch. "You're human. You faced down 3 Ironclaw assassins with kitchen equipment. You could have died. You should have run. Should have called for Nate. Should have let them slaughter your sons?" Nora met his eyes, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "That was going to happen over my dead body. Literally, if necessary." Something cracked in Dominic's expression. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her torn shoulder like he was afraid to touch her, afraid she might shatter under his fingers. "You're bleeding," he said, and his voice had gone quiet and dangerous. "They marked you. They dared to put their claws in what's mine." "I'm fine," Nora started, but Dominic was already peeling back the ruined fabric of her shirt, exposing the 4 parallel gashes that ran from her shoulder to her collarbone. His pupils dilated at the sight of her blood, and for a moment she thought he might lose control again, might shift back into the wolf and tear apart corpses that were already dead. Instead, he did something that shocked her more. He bent his head and pressed his forehead against her uninjured shoulder, his breath coming in harsh pants against her skin. You defended them, he said, so quietly only she could hear. You're human and fragile, and you stood between my sons and death without hesitation. Do you understand what that means? What you've proven? Nora's free hand came up to touch his blood-matted hair before she could stop herself. It means I'm their nanny. It's literally my job description. Dominic laughed, the sound raw and broken. No human thinks that way. No human would have stayed. They would have run, would have saved themselves, would have... He pulled back to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart stutter. The boys refuse to leave your side. Look at them. Nora looked. The three princes were pressed against her, their small bodies forming a protective barrier between her and their father, their eyes glowing amber with protective fury. They were growling, she realized. Soft, constant growls directed at Dominic whenever he moved too quickly near her wounds. They've claimed you, Dominic said, something like awe creeping into his voice. They've decided you're pack, that you're theirs to protect. They've never done that before. Never chosen anyone to stand between them and me. Maybe because I'm the first person who treated them like children instead of weapons, Nora said. The world was starting to tilt in strange ways, and she wondered distantly if she was going into shock. Maybe because I fed them steak in the rain when they were hungry. Or maybe, Dominic said, his hand finally settling on her cheek with devastating gentleness, because you're exactly what this family has been missing. The heart we didn't know we needed. The queen who would burn herself to ash to keep her pack alive. I'm not a queen, Nora whispered, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. Not yet, Dominic agreed, and there was a promise in his amber eyes that made her shiver. But you will be. The moment you defended my sons, you became mine, Nora Belwyn. Mine to protect, mine to provide for, mine to... Father, Ash interrupted, his young voice sharp with warning. She's losing too much blood. We need to get her to the medical wing. Now. Dominic moved with sudden purpose, scooping Nora into his arms as if she weighed nothing, the boys trailing behind like anxious shadows. As consciousness started to slip, Nora had one clear thought. She'd come to Blackwood Estate thinking she was just a nanny, just hired help feeding strays. But somewhere between the alley and the kitchen, between birthday steak and cast-iron warfare, she'd become something else entirely. She'd become Pack. She'd become his. And God help her, she wasn't sure she wanted to be anything else. Nora woke to the smell of pine and smoke and something wild that she'd come to associate with safety. Her shoulder ached with a deep bone-level throb, but when she tried to move, she found herself pinned by three small bodies. The boys had curled around her like puppies, their breathing synchronized, their small hands clutching her uninjured arm with a possessiveness that should have felt suffocating but somehow didn't. They haven't left your side in 2 days, Dominic's voice came from somewhere to her left. She turned her head carefully and found him sitting in a leather chair beside the bed, still shirtless, his silver-white hair loose around his shoulders. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but his amber gaze was sharp and alert. The pack doctor tried to examine you. Cole nearly took his hand off. 2 days? Nora's voice came out rough, unused. The room swam into focus, not her room in the East Wing, but somewhere larger, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest and a fireplace big enough to stand in. The master suite, she realized. Dominic's room. You lost a lot of blood, Dominic said quietly. The wounds were deep, poisoned. Actually, Iron Claw dips their claws in wolfsbane to make kills slower, more painful. You should have died, his jaw tightened. But you didn't. You're stronger than you look, Nora Belwyn. Or too stubborn to die, Nora said, trying for levity despite the weight in her chest. I had 3 boys to feed. Couldn't leave them with someone who'd mess up the seasoning. Dominic didn't smile. Instead, he rose from the chair and moved to the bed, sitting on the edge with a careful grace that kept from jostling the sleeping boys. "We need to talk," he said, "about what happened in the alley, about why you're really here." Nora's heart kicked against her ribs. "The boys told me that you sent them to test me, that you'd been watching. They told you part of it." Dominic's hand came up to touch her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "But not all. The truth is, I was hunting that night, tracking Ironclaw scouts through the city, following their scent to find their safe houses. I caught your scent by accident, human, tired, lonely, but underneath it all, this inexplicable warmth. Kindness, I suppose, though I didn't recognize it at first. We're not used to that, in my world." His eyes met hers, and there was something raw in them, something vulnerable that didn't match the monsters she'd seen in the kitchen. "I followed you to the bistro, watched you buy that steak with money you didn't have, watched you sit alone on your birthday, about to eat the only luxury you'd allowed yourself in months. And I thought, here's another human, selfish and small, who'll devour what's hers and ignore everything else. But then you saw the boys," Nora whispered. "No." Dominic's hand slid to her neck, his thumb resting against her pulse. "Then I sent the boys. I wanted to see what you'd do when confronted with monsters. Whether you'd scream, run, call for help. Whether you'd see them as threats or as the hungry children they were." His voice dropped lower. "You knelt in the rain and gave them everything. Your meal, your time, your touch. You looked at my son's cursed, dangerous, half-human abominations according to most of our world, and you saw creatures worth feeding." Tears burned behind Nora's eyes. "They were starving." "They're always starving," Dominic said harshly. "That's the curse. They're never full, never satisfied, never." He stopped, jaw working. "But with you, for the first time in their lives, they ate and felt content. They came home that night smelling of rosemary and peace, and they told me about the human who'd fed them like they mattered, like they were worth something more than fear and hatred." He leaned closer, and Nora could smell the wild on him, could see the way his pupils contracted like a predator's. "I brought you here because my sons chose you, but I kept you here because I chose you. The moment you stood in that kitchen with nothing but a skillet and stubbornness, facing down wolves that could have torn you apart, I knew. You're not just a nanny, Nora. You're not just hired help. You're the heart this pack has been missing. The piece that makes us whole instead of just dangerous." Dominic, Nora started, but he pressed a finger to her lips, silencing her. "The pack gathers tonight," he said. "Every wolf under my protection, every ally, every member of my bloodline, they need to see you. They need to understand that the human who defended my sons, who bled for them, who faced death without flinching, she's not prey anymore. She's pack. She's queen. She's mine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Nora thought about the alley, about 3 pairs of amber eyes watching her in the rain, about the choice she'd made to give away her birthday meal, not knowing it would change everything. She thought about Dominic standing in the shadows, testing her, waiting to see if she was worthy of the family he'd been trying to protect alone for so long. "I fed 3 stray dogs," she said softly, not realizing their father was the Lycan King, not realizing he'd already decided I belonged to him. "Not decided," Dominic corrected, his forehead pressing against hers. "Recognized. The moment you knelt in that alley, you became mine. I just had to wait for you to realize it." The boys stirred against her, Kai mumbling something about bacon in his sleep. Ash's hand tightened on her arm, and Cole pressed closer, seeking her warmth even in unconsciousness. They'd chosen her too, she realized, not because she was powerful or special, but because she'd seen them as worth feeding, worth protecting, worth loving. "So what happens now?" Nora asked. Dominic smiled, and there was something fierce and possessive and infinitely tender in it. "Now, you heal. Then you stand beside me before the pack and let them see what I see, a human who's more wolf than half our bloodline. A queen who'd burn the world down to protect what's hers." His lips brushed her forehead. "And then, Nora Belwyn, we feed our family. Together." Outside the window, the sun was setting over Blackwood Estate, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere in the house, Nora could hear sounds of preparation tables being set, meat being prepared, the pack gathering for the ceremony that would change everything. She should have been terrified, should have been planning her escape. Instead, she reached up and threaded her fingers through Dominic's hair, pulling him down until their lips met in a kiss that tasted like smoke and promises and a future she'd never imagined in that rain-soaked alley. She'd fed 3 stray dogs on her birthday, and in return, they'd given her a kingdom, a family, and a love fierce enough to weather any storm. Some sacrifices, she thought as the boys sighed contentedly against her and Dominic deepened the kiss, were worth everything.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.